Hi everyone. I'm just going to be doing a fairly quick video today because I'm so swamped with editing, and Yom Kippur also begins today. This is going to be based off of a blog post which I originally published on the 21st of August 2020 about called age-based category problems, and it's basically just, how do you categorize in particular books in the middle grade and like YA classifications, or I guess like smaller, like younger, like simpler chapter books. How, where do you shelve them in the library, in the bookstore, who's going to read what? And it's just a lot of agents and editors, they unfortunately just like, seem out of touch with how actual children themselves, the supposed intended target audience, like want to read about their own actual peers. So let's just start getting down with it. It seems as though, at least in the US, so you can correct me if it's a little bit different in other parts of the world, age-based categories of books have become more rigid and inflexible over the last decade, and lines that existed when I was young have radically shifted. Some of these developments have been for the better, so for example, most modern middle grade and YA books are written for those respective age groups instead of younger kids reading up. Like, if you're like, I guess my age, I was born in 79 or around, like maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, so thereabouts, you were like a preteen, teen in the 90s or in the 80s, you can kind of remember a lot of these like, supposed middle grade books. They were written, I don't want to say dumbed down, that I don't want to insult the writers or anything like that, but it just feels like the situations and the language involving, like, 14, 16-year-olds, they're just not what actual like children, teenagers, those ages are going through, or how they like want to read about things like that. It's more intended for the 13-year-olds or the 12-year-olds. Oh, I want to be a big kid. Oh, I'm reading up. I'm reading about the fun, exciting adventures of a 15-year-old in high school. And so it's basically, these were not actually written for children the actual age of the characters reading. And that's, unfortunate aspect of, literary history. But thankfully, it does seem to have improved a fair bit since back in the day. And while there is just as much fluff as there was in my generation, there are a lot more substantial books for teens and preteens instead of derivative, interchangeable books. I mean, if you're like, from my generation, you probably remember all these, like, cookie cutter problem novels, and that really had a big like inspiration on my own writing, the way I, was like forming my characters and stories and such. When I was a preteen back in the early 90s, I was, innocently copying what I read in books and I was seeing on after school specials and stuff on the television. Series books, so ubiquitous in my day, I shouldn't even have to list the series. You all know them, like Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley High, and a whole slew of other books, all the many spin-offs from those particular series, and so many other different series. They have largely gone by the wayside, replaced by trilogies and duologies. Modern series are nothing like the never ending, keep the cash cow going, quantity over quality ones of yesterday. So, for example, if someone really is writing a series and not just, oh, let's just do 100, 200 books because that's what the kiddies are reading and that's going to make me lots of bucks, or my agent and editor are like really like, oh, urging me on, write more books, don't move on to anything else, just write this. So the modern series, they tend to be, I would say, maybe like 7ish to 10 books maybe, or sometimes like I know the series is ended now, Phyllis Reynolds Naylor's Alice series that had, I believe, 28 books in it, including the 3 prequels, which she later added to it. So that's kind of on the long end for a modern series, but it's, not like so long. It's just a complete like cash cow and mindless excuse to keep writing new adventures for these characters. It was always, driving towards the end of Alice graduating from like high school and showing her adult years. I really didn't like the final book. Now I'll tell you everything. I should have a future video about that, when Alice ages from 18 to 60. It was just bad, but again, like that's kind of on the long end for a series, but I would not consider that, too long if it's like a coming of age book, and each book in the series covers like, about a quarter, a half of the year, and as it goes on and the character becomes older, maybe each book covers a year, and particularly because like series about like teenagers and preteens and stuff, they're many of them are they're just built around the school year, so it kind of like makes sense for each book to cover a year in the character's life, or maybe in the earlier books, oh, the first half of the year or the first quarter of the year. But so anyway, so yeah, they're nothing like the old cash cow series back in the day. But age based categories seem less of a general classification than a rigid pigeonholing now. For example, the oft repeated kids read up mantra has led to many agents and editors not taking books straddling the fence between upper middle grade and lower YA, despite many librarians, writers, parents, and kids themselves longing for more books about characters age, let's say, 12 to 14. If they don't already exist, surprise, you can actually do this. Make shelves for upper middle grade, mature middle grade, lower YA, tween, or whatever you would like to call it, or whatever the people running your library or bookstore are demanding you call it, like the same standards I had when I worked for a newspaper. It didn't matter what your own particular like writing or speaking style was. You had to use like certain phraseology or terminology consistently across everything in the newspaper because we just had to adhere to like certain style conventions. And that solves the supposed crisis of not knowing where to put these books. I mean, how hard is it to make new like shelf space, or at least if you can't have the budget to buy new shelves or whatever, or you don't have enough space to expand into another section of the room or whatever, you can at least write on a slip of paper whatever the technical term is for the things you classify, or write things on the I'm blanking on the terminology, but you know what I mean. There's like a strip of paper hanging off of the shelf, and it says like the genre or the series name or the author name or whatever like that, and you can just put that under those books that already exist on the shelves, like totally problem solved. Yes, kids do tend to read up, but that doesn't mean literally no kids ever read about characters their own age, nor about slightly younger characters, believe it or not. Sometimes a story with kids aged, for example, 8 to 10, demands to be written in an upper middle grade style instead of as a chapter book or lower middle grade. Many classic middle grade books have protagonists above or below the apparent modern sweet spot of 11 to 12, and they're neither written for teens nor little kids. We need to quit treating all kids like reluctant readers who can't handle more than common core vocab, paragraphs of more than 5 lines, if that, chapters above 5 pages, if not much, much shorter, sophisticated themes, or more mature situations. Likewise, many great adult books just happen to focus on child or teen characters, yet weren't written as children's books or what would now be considered YA. Particularly in a Bildungsroman, which follows a character over her or his entire childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, you can't neatly classify it in just one age-based category. Many books now considered YA classics, like The Catcher in the Rye. I seem to be in a minority of people who actually like that book, and I don't get a perverse kind of like excited thrill out of like bashing it. Oh, I'm cool. I'm bashing The Catcher in the Rye. Oh, give me all these props. Like, you're not original bashing that book. Like, some people just think they're the first person ever who started the conversation bashing that book. I mean, I should probably do a whole video about why I don't like this trend of people bashing The Catcher in the Rye and acting like Holden is a terrible character. That's kind of the point of his character, is to be like unreliable and confused. He's a teenage boy and it's the 1950s. All these people are just, they're barking up the wrong tree. They're just like, so like confused and trying to sound, oh, I'm cool and fun and trendy. I'm bashing The Catcher in the Rye. Oh, give me props. I just hate that. But anyway, lots of those books now considered YA classics were originally published as adult literature, and the authors probably had no idea like teens would ever really like them, or they would catch on more as teen books than adult books. Other books, now mostly read by adults, were intended as children's books, and indeed are shelved in both sections in libraries and bookstores, particularly because until I guess the very late 19th century, there wasn't, I mean, there were obviously books written for and about children, but it just wasn't really a mainstream, like popular, like concept. You either had like books about children who were written for adults, like the children, obviously, children did have like more advanced reading if they were lucky enough to be educated. So there wasn't a concept, oh, you're going to gradually move from like chapter picture books and then chapter books and then older, more advanced chapter books, and then lower middle grade, and then middle grade, upper middle grade, lower YA, like middle YA, regular YA, new adult, which unfortunately isn't much of a thing anymore, and then adult books. You started like reading books written for adults that just happen to be about children with, children's adventures and stuff like that. That should also be another video about the evolution of like children's literature written specifically as children's literature, not just like more adult-ish books children were expected to be reading. But anyway, so and those books that were intended as children's books are now shelved in both sections. I just said that. The choice should not be between aging characters up or down for the writer, or being made to feel there's no market for example, a mature middle grade book with 9-year-olds or a YA book with 13-year-olds. I mean, it all depends on the type of the story the writer intends. It's not so simple as just age the character down to from, let's say, like 13 to 11, or age the character up from, 10, 11 to 14. Well, that very frequently, particularly if the writer intended that age for a reason, or it's part of a whole series, like with certain events tied to certain years and such, that completely like unravels the whole intention and the purpose of the story. So like if the character is turning, let's say, like 10 in like 1920 instead of 1923 or whatever, that might just throw everything off. Or when the characters get older, certain things are just like totally out of whack. So like writers generally choose like the starting ages of their characters for a reason, particularly if it's, part of a whole long running series. Changing a character's age should only be something you do because a small, still voice compels you and it makes sense, not because you felt pressured into it as the only good choice. I felt compelled to make the age of my Atlantic City characters ambiguous in the books formerly known as the very first and the very next. I'm still long overdue to do videos on those two books, which have been published for quite some time, to make them seem more timeless, not rigidly bound to any one age-based category and off limits to the rest. For over 20 years, actually, it's been over 30 years now. I created them in November 25th of 1991. Wow, it's been over 30 years now. And so I was so confident in them being born in late 1929 through mid 1931. Most of the characters are born in 1930, especially since these books aren't intended as straight historical fiction. It's like a blend of like spoof, satire, deliberately over-the-top humor, and regular historical fiction. Aeopolis, the fictional neighborhood in Atlantic City, isn't meant to be a normal neighborhood either, whether in the present day or in the past. And I like a frequent thing about the book when these other people come to town, or when they're like out of town visiting places, these people not used to what passes for normal in Aeopolis, they're so shocked. Oh, wow, I can't believe it. You're like letting your children drink beer and they're like a 13, or you're like already dating at 12. Does no one like understand what is normal? This is weird and like goofy. I can't believe what you people are doing. And that's like a constant, like running gag throughout like each of the books in the various series. I do still have to make some videos about my Atlantic City books, but I've obviously written about them many times in my blog posts if you guys read my blog. There's no just about aging characters up or down when you have been with them for years, and that age has become so deeply embedded into every fiber of that world. Even when I was their age and barely older than they were, I created them when we were both 11 years old, although I was almost 12 years old at that point in November 91. They never felt like typical kids of that age. They were a special kind of preteen, I guess, that's, lampshading. I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, but now it just seems so much like, lampshading to justify these kids acting so much different than actual, like, even the most, like, mature and satirical, like, preteens and teens of that age. So after all over 30 years in, I no longer remember if I always truly intended it that way, or I developed an elaborate justification for mental sourcing as time went by. Source stands from soap opera rapid aging syndrome. If you've watched soap operas, I know they're kind of going the way of the dodo these days for many, many reasons. But if you're like familiar with soap operas, you've probably seen, oh, the child is born and then like in a few years later, oh, the kid is already 10 years old or 5, and oops, 3 more seasons later, the child is now a teenager in the early 20s because, oh, you can't waste time with a baby or a little kid. They have to rush right to like more like relevant, interesting storylines about teenagers and like people in their 20s. Like, who actually likes sourcing? And like, some of these examples are just so ridiculous. They go right from Little League to the boardroom, or right from like kindergarten to fighting in the Vietnam War. It's just a totally ridiculous concept. Like, why does anyone think that's a good idea? I hate sourcing. Why do we need to keep pigeonholing books into strict age-based categories instead of just telling stories as they naturally unfold? I mean, what a concept. Not all books with teens are automatically YA, just as some books with the child or preteen characters have a writing style and topical content more of interest to adults. Instead of rigidly enforcing barriers, we need to judge individual books by their intent, style, language, and content. I know, what a shocking concept in this day and age. The literary world would indeed be a very boring place if everyone only read about people roughly their own age and automatically dismissed any characters younger or older. So thank you guys very much for watching. Please leave me a comment, whether you are a writer or a reader or just someone who has got children in the age of like middle grade, YA, whatever, and let me know what your own personal experience has been with this topic. What are your thoughts? Did you have any favorite books when you were younger that would now be in a completely different age category or might not get published at all because, for example, it's a YA style book about like a 12-year-old instead of a 16-year-old, or it's a middle grade book written about, like an 11-year-old who is not particularly middle grade. I know 11 is a middle grade age, but just more of a like mature content instead of like more simplistic, like shorter chapters and such like that, or just anything that comes to mind from this general topic. And I do love seeing comments. I had some unfortunate like cyberbullying in one of my older videos recently. I've like reported him for harassment, so obviously I have zero tolerance for nasty hate comments, and you know exactly what a personal attack is. That's not just a sweet, innocent difference of opinion or a critique of my opinion. You know what a personal attack is. So obviously, as long as you're not being nasty, I love seeing comments from you guys and having intelligent conversations. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I will see you guys again very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.